Sorry we couldn't give you tables to sit at. There were too many of you. This is a good problem to have. I'm Rosa Brooks. I teach law here, and I'm the director of the Human Rights Institute, and we're really delighted that you all turned out today for this conference. I need to make an overdue disclaimer, which we forgot to say before, but sort of goes without saying, but I will say it anyway. Everybody speaking is speaking in his or her personal capacity only. They made up everything they said. It's not true, not a word of it, and it does not represent the views of the U.S. government, the U.S. military, or anybody whatsoever except themselves. So just and now this will save everybody else from having to make individual disclaimers. So just keep that in mind as you listen, that people are making this stuff up. It's a great pleasure to introduce Tom Ricks, our lunch speaker. Tom's bio is in your packets, but I'll just say a few words about Tom. Right now, he is the special military correspondent for the Washington Post. He's a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security and a contributing editor to Foreign Policy magazine, where some of you may have seen his blog. If you haven't checked it out, I hope you will. Tom has been a journalist for many, many, many years. There is hardly a combat zone or trouble spot in the world that Tom has not been to and reported from. He has been part of 2 different Pulitzer Prize-winning journalistic teams, both during his years at the Wall Street Journal and at the Washington Post for reporting on military affairs. You probably all know him best for his books, which we are selling outside, and we hope you will purchase. He wrote in 2000. He wrote the book Fiasco, which many of you have probably read. The American Military Adventure in Iraq, 2003-2005, which became a #1 New York Times bestseller. And he has a brand new book out, also out there at the table in the back. Tom Nachbar is holding this up here, called The Gamble, General Petraeus and the American Military Adventure in Iraq, 2006 to 2008. Some of you may have seen Tom on The Daily Show. Tom is very entertaining, which is why we have asked him to be your lunch speaker. I know it's customary at lunchtime for people to make jokes like, I'm in a dangerous position standing between you and your lunch. You've eaten your lunch, but now I'm in the dangerous position of standing in between you and your lunch speaker. But let me just say a couple things about Tom that may not be as well known. Number one is he's probably one of the few people in this room who's gone recreationally skiing in Afghanistan. Is that right, Tom? And number 2, he does have the ability to foretell the future, so you should listen very closely to what he says. In June 2001, he published his first novel called A Soldier's Duty, which was about the U.S. military intervention in Afghanistan. So Tom has a lot to tell us about not only what has happened in the past, but perhaps what will happen in the future. And in particular, as has already come out, I think, a bit in the first panel, a lot of these rule of law efforts undertaken by the military implicate much, much broader issues of how does the military define its role, how does the military adapt to changing circumstances, how do we coordinate efforts so that civilians in the military aren't just doing completely different things that undermine each other. Tom's expertise is not so much the rule of law, but nevertheless, I think that his stories about the American military intervention in Iraq have quite a lot of lessons for those of us who work on rule of law issues. So, Tom, thank you very much for joining us, and welcome.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction. What I hope to do is talk for about 15 or 20 minutes and then get to your questions, which I think are always the more interesting part of this sort of thing. And it's much easier for me just to listen to your questions than to try to guess what you want to talk about. First, though, I want to talk about the Iraq War and perhaps give you some context in which to talk about rule of law, especially going down the road. I think there are 3 things that people don't understand about the war in Iraq. The people in this country don't understand about the war in Iraq right now. First is how difficult and how different the surge was from previous policy. Second is that the surge failed. And third is that the war is far from over. And what I'd like to do is explain those thoughts and then get to your questions. First, how difficult it was. I think the surge brought the 6 most difficult months of the war, at least so far, the spring of 2007. You had a lot of people in Baghdad involved in it who didn't think it was going to work. You had a lot of people in Baghdad who thought that it was failing as American casualties increased, and you had the American media essentially lose the bubble on the war, no longer understand the narrative. I think for several years the media had been ahead of the military in understanding the situation in Iraq. As of January 2007, I think they started to fall behind. They didn't understand counterinsurgency theory. They didn't understand what the U.S. military was trying to do. And they were being pulled out of Iraq by news organizations that were turning their attention to the American election more and couldn't afford two big budget items, the war and the election. How tough it was. In my book, General Petraeus, looking back on the spring of 2007, refers to it as a horrific nightmare. In the spring of 2007, they began with 70 KIA in February, 71 in March, 96 in April, 120 in May. This was with no sign of a turnaround. Units moving off the FOBs out into outposts had to fight their way into neighborhoods. I write about one unit that encountered 50 IEDs, bombs, en route to the outpost they were trying to establish. I talk about another platoon that was trying to fight its way to establish an outpost and got in a firefight with insurgents trying to prevent them from establishing this outpost. And in the middle of the firefight, the platoon sergeant looked up and saw two Iraqi kids frozen with fear standing in the middle of the street. He jumped up and grabbed the two kids and pulled them over to safety. Another soldier in the platoon said later, that's when we won that firefight, because the Iraqi people saw us protecting Iraqi people. And after 4 or 5 years of American mistakes and incompetence, Iraqis no longer believed what we told them. They had to see it. Words no longer had any currency with the average Iraqi. They had had promises broken. They had heard that things were going to happen that didn't happen. They had seen a generation of allies surfaced by the Americans and then slaughtered because the Americans failed to protect the police chiefs, the mayors, the city council people. In one battle in Tarmiya, the northernmost outpost of the 1st Cavalry Division, actually the northernmost outpost of the Baghdad-oriented surge, there were 38 soldiers in the outpost. One morning at 7 a.m., the outpost was attacked, was hit by a truck bomb so large that soldiers 7 miles away heard the explosion. The outpost was then hit by RPGs, mortars, and machine gun fire. They held the outpost. Their communications were knocked out for a period of time because the generator had been killed by the bomb. And the soldier trying to find the batteries for the backup radios could only dig with one hand because he had one hand on his neck holding a shard of glass that was sticking out of it, because when he took the glass out, it would pump. So he put the glass back in and dug with one hand for the batteries. When he reestablished communications, the soldiers' main concern on the roof was that the battalion headquarters would pull them out. Battalion didn't. They held the outpost because General Odierno's order to them had been, never take land that you're going to give up. Hold the terrain, because you have to tell the Iraqis you're going to be there. You can't show up and leave anymore. At the end of the day, of the 38 soldiers, 2 were dead, 29 were wounded, but they held. A second misunderstood aspect of the surge was who was running it. In many ways, I think the transition to the Obama administration began at the Pentagon with the arrival of Defense Secretary Gates, which is one reason it made sense to keep him on. In December 2006 and January 2007, in many ways, the Bush administration turned the war over to the dissidents. Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who was our top diplomat for the last couple of years, reveals in the book that he was opposed to the invasion of Iraq. General Petraeus, taking over as top commander in February 2007, had just completed working on the counterinsurgency manual, which can be read as a scathing critique of the American conduct of the first 4 years of the war. The people they brought in around them also had the quality of dissidents. There was a new American humility, a willingness to listen. And one point here is that the surge was as much about talking as about fighting, sometimes with the same people, even almost at the same time. It struck me that 3 advisors that I kept on running into in Baghdad were David Kilcullen, an Australian infantryman turned anthropologist, Saadi Othman, a Palestinian-American who on 9/11 was a taxi driver in New York City and said he felt violated as a New Yorker, as an American, and as an Arab. And Emma Skye, a tiny bird-like British woman, anti-military, anti-American, pacifist, who became General Odierno's political advisor, or as I heard it referred to once by General Petraeus, you mean Odierno's insurgent. The point here is that there was a new humility, a new willingness to listen, a new understanding that the American way is not the only way and probably is not even the best way. That the only solutions are going to be local solutions. That's the only solution that's going to be sustainable. I mentioned talking being as important as fighting. I think my favorite part of this book is about a young American captain, Sam Cooke, with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. Anybody here know him? Interesting character. Sam was based in a town up in the northern Sunni Triangle and heard one day of a local insurgent boasting that he had planted 200 bombs against the Americans. This insurgent, by the way, had been radicalized by the Abu Ghraib scandal, and that's when he had become an insurgent. Well, 2 years ago, a smart, young, tough American captain, hearing of a local insurgent leading a network that planted 200 bombs, would promptly go out, launch a raid, and kill or capture him and ship the guy off to Abu Ghraib. Job well done, everybody says. Now, it might be 6 months before that guy was interrogated. He might submerge himself in the population and never be interrogated. Instead, Sam Cooke did something that's almost un-American. He invited the insurgent to tea. And it was a neat thing to do because the insurgent, receiving the invitation, realized that this American officer knew where the insurgent was. So he came in and said, "Why are you inviting me to tea instead of arresting me?" He was curious. Sam said, "Well, I want to talk to you," because Sam's notion was, let's bring the guy in and try to bring his network in as well. Let's see what the guy has. Well, the guy explains to him he's deeply anti-American, and over the course of conversations, says to him one day, "America is the devil. I hate everything about America. Nothing good can come from it." Sam listens. He's been around Iraq a while. He knows the most popular ringtone on Iraqi cell phones is Titanic. He says, "Well, you watched Titanic, didn't you?" And the insurgent says, "Yes, 7 times. I cry every time at the end when Leonardo DiCaprio slips into the water." "There you go," says Sam. They find common ground. Now, the guy never becomes pro-American, but he does talk. And after about 6 weeks of this, he says, "Okay, I'm willing to come in, but for reasons of self-respect, I cannot surrender to the Americans. I want you to arrange for me to surrender to the Iraqis, but then I'll come to work for you once you put me on your payroll." Sam says, "We're an economic power. Let's use economic power. We're more powerful than Al-Qaeda economically. At least we were back then." So he puts the guy on the payroll. The guy sits down and starts talking to him. He says, "You know those Iraqi police at the checkpoint? That's why you never caught me. They always called me on the cell phone before you got to my house. You know that pit we had dug out back?" "No, what pit?" says Sam. "It's the pit I hid in whenever you guys were in the neighborhood, and we had the cow trained to sit on top of it. That sniper rifle you found me with, that was a gift from the Iraqi major you work with. And by the way, the police chief has a deal with us. We don't attack him. He doesn't attack us. He says your war was with the Americans. He's sitting it out." Conversations like this took place in Iraq repeatedly over the last couple of years. As Sam said, it was like somebody had turned on the lights. Okay, why do I say the surge failed then? In a nutshell, because it didn't achieve its stated goal. Militarily, it succeeded in improving security. But the stated goal of the surge was to improve security in such a way as to create a breathing space in which a political breakthrough could occur. General Odierno says in the book that we did create a breathing space and that some Iraqi leaders, and I think he meant Maliki, used it to move backwards. That we thought they'd go forwards because that's the way we go. They saw there was a different way to go in that space. Indeed, none of the basic questions that faced Iraq before the surge were solved. All of them are still hanging fire out there. All of them have led to violence in the past. All of them may well lead to violence again. Foremost, how do you share oil revenue? What is the disposition of the city of Kirkuk, a disputed city? What's the relationship between Sunni, Shia, and Kurd? Where does power reside in the Shia community? What is the role of Iran? For my money, the biggest winner in this war so far. For that matter, what is the future shape of Iraq? Strong central government that Maliki seems to want, or loose confederation? Unsettled, still hanging fire. So arguably what the surge did was kick the can down the road. It may not sound like the best of outcomes, but it sure beats a lot of the possible alternatives. So, where are we now? We are to Obama's war. My guess is Obama's war is going to be longer in Iraq than Bush's war, which is 5 years and 10 months. I don't think the war ends because you hang up a mission accomplished banner on an aircraft carrier. I don't think the war ends because you say after August 2010 it's a non-combat mission. The war ends when American troops stop dying and when Iraqi civilians stop dying. And I think that's a long way in the future. General Odierno says in the book he would like to see 35,000 U.S. troops in Iraq in the year 2015. I think that's not a bad prediction. The difference, of course, between Iraq and, say, Korea, Germany, and Japan is that as long as American troops are in Iraq, some of them are going to be fighting and some of them are going to be dying. What really worries me about the current situation is that I think Obama has inherited the worst foreign policy situation of any new president ever coming into office. And the scary aspect of that is it isn't even his number one problem. So here we are in 2009. We've got 3 rounds of elections scheduled for Iraq this year. We'll have a small number of withdrawals this year. It was striking to me that Obama eloquently waltzed away from a key campaign promise and nobody seemed to notice. He had said 1 brigade out, and the campaign trail, he promised 1 brigade out for a month for 16 months. The first speech he gives on Iraq, he says, oh, by the way, there's not going to be many troop withdrawals this year. Right now, it's about 140,000. I think the plan is maybe get down to 128,000 by the end of this year, which is about the U.S. average for the entire war. So he's not doing a quick pullout. And while he thinks it's going to be a non-combat mission after August 2010, I think Obama is only now just realizing how screwed he is with Iraq. So the war is not over. It is different. The war has morphed several times, though. It was a blitzkrieg invasion. It was a botched occupation. It was a slow-rising but durable insurgency. It was a small civil war in central Iraq. Then it was a well-executed American counteroffensive. And now it's, I think, kind of in a lull as people try to figure out the post-American future in Iraq. The bottom line, though, is I think Iraq is going to be the longest war in American history. So, for this conference, 3 takeaways. Should the U.S. military be doing stability operations? Well, 2 answers. First, no, it shouldn't. It should be the last alternative to everything else, but sometimes it's going to have to do it. Second, my question, should you call them stability operations? No, you shouldn't. It's a misnomer. American policy is not stability. If all you wanted in Iraq was stability, you'd find another Saddam tomorrow morning, put him in office, and leave. American policy, at least for the last several years, was to institute democracy, the rule of law. These are fundamentally destabilizing in a place like the Middle East. Democracy upsets people. Shiite majorities taking power is a very upsetting notion for people in the rest of the Arab world. So if we were to be honest about it, the manual on stability operations would be called revolutionary operations. But I think we can all hold our breath for a long time before we see the U.S. military issue something with that title on it. That takes care of my prepared comments. I'd love to get to your questions. I just got one request. Don't be too polite. I'm a reporter. So, fire when ready. Colonel Martins, would you like to give a rebuttal?
Oh, I haven't read your book.
But if you had, what would you say?
Well, I did read the excerpt that was printed in the Post, and it struck me that you were sort of putting the locus of innovation at the multinational core headquarters level. And again, without having read your larger argument, it came to mind for me that it could be very true that a lot of very new, interesting things were happening with General Odierno and Emma, his insurgent, and Marty Stanton and others, I think you talk about. And yet at the strategic level and the operational strategic level at these other echelons, as well as down at David Pascal's level, at the tactical level, lots of new and different things were happening as well. So it seemed like you were sort of picking a fight that wasn't really happening. I mean, there were a lot of people pulling water in what became a similar direction that I think got some coherent results that I think you acknowledge. So why don't you address that?
Could you all hear the question, or should I repeat it? Repeat it? Colonel Martins, who was General Petraeus' top lawyer in Iraq and is the king of rule of law. I think it even says it on his briefcase. Said, judging by the excerpts from my book that ran in the Post, it looked to him as if I focused at the core level on operational innovations, not at higher stuff that was going on at MNFI, with strategic innovations, or out in the field with tactical innovations. I would say, in the excerpt, because that excerpt focused on what was happening at CORE in December '06, which was really, by the way, in terms of JAG and command, is a very interesting situation. And I actually printed the orders in the appendix because they so intrigued me. In early December '06, General Odierno was given his orders by General Casey. And the whole thing is right there in the appendix. General Casey says, you will move your troops out of the cities, consolidate on big FOBs, protect lines of communication, and seal the borders. Reading between the lines, I read that as, and let these Iraqis have the civil war they seem to want. General Odierno, having privately concluded that he didn't want to lose the war on his watch, totally revamps these orders over the next 2 months. And the orders he shows to General Petraeus, February 707, state, and they're reprinted in the appendix, I'm going to move off the big FOBs into the cities. I'm going to establish outposts. I'm going to drop transition to Iraqi forces as the top mission priority and instead make protecting Iraqi people the top priority. And I'm going to be out there in the city. Almost an entire reversal. A nervy move on Odierno's part. Now, General Petraeus is off in the background, not yet appointed for most of this period, but talking to Odierno on the phone so much that eventually General Casey orders Petraeus not to talk to Odierno anymore until he gets to Iraq, which is an order I believe General Petraeus deemed inappropriate and chose to disregard on the grounds that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs had asked him to look at Iraq, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs outranked General Casey. Do I have that right? But it was a very interesting period that concluded a 6-month period in which a retired General Jack Keane essentially acted as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, by which I mean he formulated policy, he took the policy of the White House and sold them on it. They approved it. He took it back to the Pentagon and told them how to implement it. And then he went back to retirement. General Dunlap.
Tom, I haven't had a chance to read your book, but I guarantee you I will. It's not an endorsement of a non-federal entity. It's a personal comment that I haven't had. I have read Bob Woodward's book, and I think you just touched on an extremely interesting point, the role of General Keane. And in fact, the chairman is not a superior officer to General Casey because by law he's not permitted to exercise command authority. What is your take on Bob Woodward's book, if in fact you've read it, and you heard your book? And B, what do you make of the role of General Keane? And is that some kind of model that retired officers ought to emulate? He seems to have gotten a lot of praise for what he did.
I have read Woodward's book a couple of times. I find it very White House-centric. It's the White House's account of how they won the war. maybe good as far as it goes, but it's like reading a book written, in World War II about, how the bureaucrats at the War Department won the war without ever mentioning Admiral Nimitz or General Bradley. To my knowledge, actually, I don't think Odierno talked to Woodward for his book. What do I think of the role of General Keane? I think it's really intriguing. I think Keane obeyed the Maoist dictum, though. Power is never given, it's taken. There was a power vacuum that he stepped into. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Joint Staff were not, and the Army staff, I would say, were not doing their jobs. They were giving the White House a bunch of humma, yes, sir, 3 bags full. And they never really went through the hard job of strategy. It was only when Keane intervenes and some other outsiders are brought into the White House that Bush stops being the cheerleader-in-chief of the war and starts being the commander-in-chief, by which I mean he starts asking tough questions. General Casey, you told me Together Forward 1 would improve security in Baghdad. It didn't. You told me Together Forward 2 would improve security in Baghdad. It didn't. What's your plan now? Well, Together Forward 3, sir. And that's the point at which Casey lost his job, without knowing it. So Keane stepped in. Now, Keane is told to bug out at one point by General Casey. And I think it's Casey who meets him at Walter Reed and says, knock it off. He says, you're not accountable, Jack. We are. Well, I think that was actually the opposite. The problem was that the system was not holding senior officers accountable, was not saying, you said this would happen, it didn't, what are you going to do about it, was not asking the basic strategic questions. Keane ejected accountability into the system. As a legal question, is this the best way to run the railroad? No, I think it shows the failure of Goldwater-Nichols. That the Goldwater-Nichols command structure failed here. It looked like it was working, but it was as a whited sepulcher in that it really was empty inside. There never were the hard strategic decision-making. And in fact, American policymaking in the war does not become effective until Odierno and Keane step outside the Goldwater-Nichols command structure, and Odierno bypasses several echelons of command. His immediate superior, the sink for the theater, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and takes it right to the White House and sells it. To my knowledge, Odierno was the only senior officer in the chain of command who supported the surge. Now, General Schoonmaker and Admiral Mullen will tell you I supported the surge. No, they didn't. They supported a 2-brigade increase. They were not down with the surge. And in fact, General Pace goes to Crawford, Texas, Christmas '06, and ready to peddle a 2-brigade surge, and essentially gets thrown out of the room. And the next day at the Joint Staff, they get a phone call. You know that 5-brigade surge we told you not to worry about? We need the plan. Does that answer your question?
It does. It generates a follow-up. Nobody else has a question.
I do have one thing on retired officers, though. I'm a hard liner on retired general officers. I really think it's just terrible the way the general officers have become involved in election campaigns. I was really turned off to see a bunch of retired general officers parading at the Democratic Convention like beauty contest contestants. Here we have Miss Air Force, I think they have every right to participate in the American process. They should not do with the names of their services attached. And I think this is a failure of the service chiefs of staff to police. They are the stewards of their profession, if nothing else. They got nothing else to do these days. I mean, all their other responsibilities have migrated. At least they might police the profession and say, you got every right to sign your name as endorser John Smith. You may not sign it as Major General John Smith, retired. And if you do, I will issue a letter saying that I disagree with you at that step. I think if the service chiefs asked the retired General Officer Corps to go along with that publicly, they probably would. Yes, please.
Harvard Struck from National War College. The general's question sort of pushes the notion of the proper professional role of the military, both active and retired, and then you raise sort of civilian relations. I'm kind of curious because your books exist because of people superhero, both active and retired. And if you play a real professional ethic, for instance, one of the rules I'm familiar with, there are very few leaks that come out of the Supreme Court. And the one book was against Woodward, and that book was discredited because law folks always think that they are involved in decision-making law clerk. Vis-a-vis the individuals that you're speaking to who are literally at the center and choose to speak to you. And there's a sense of that's appropriate, that somehow, how does the military get its message out? But you become a very unique individual because you can protect people, you can burn people, and you can make people heroes. So how do you go through that logic, which then gives the spin of the books that become so popular that people like to look behind the curtain and see what's going on, and you have that unique role, and you play that role and continue to play that.
Do I need to repeat the question? Okay. The question is, where do I get off? saying generals should be discreet and not, play these public role and so on, and then go and do books based on all these, private interviews, embargoed interviews with all these guys in which all their secrets are told. I think my answer is, just because you cover a plane crash doesn't mean you want the plane to crash. You cover what happens. I've had that feeling sometimes as somebody leaked to me. I'm appalled that you're doing this, but it sure will make a great story. There were specific times I remember when people I remember one day, this is, I think, in early '01, I got a phone call. I'm sitting at my desk at the Post. Tom, you won't believe what Rumsfeld said in the tank this afternoon. I said, yeah, what? He said the last thing he said was, and I don't want to read about this in tomorrow's Washington Post. And I said, what a great quote. Have to put that in the paper. And we did. Just to tweak Rumsfeld a little bit. I am conflicted. But, you cover it. I'm reminded of what a friend of mine, Elliot Cohen, once said of an officer speaking out against Clinton. He said, I agree with everything you said, but I'll fight to the death your right to say it. And I do kind of have that feeling. I'm sometimes amazed what people tell me. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does.
Okay, any questions from the cheap seats? Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. Major Dan Harvey. Just had a quick question as far as when you read The Gamble, you come away with one impression of General Odierno, much different than Fiasco. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, and then whether or not you saw that as kind of a trend among some of the more senior commanders.
I think you all heard that because he asked in a good Marine way. Odierno in the Fiasco and Odierno and Gamble, very different people. Yeah, he was one of the villains of Fiasco. I laid at his feet that he used tactics that were deeply counterproductive and helped inflame the insurgency. Not just my view, but the view of an Army IG report, a secret intelligence report by Colonel Stuart Harrington, the MP battalion commander attached to him for a while, various other complaints and filings. In the Gamble, there's no question that he's one of the heroes. One day I'm sitting there in Baghdad, and I said, General Odierno, how do I get from the Odierno I saw in Fiasco to the Odierno I see now? And he said, typically of Odierno, Tom, not my problem, your problem. So, Tom's answer, I think three things. First, his son got hit by an RPG in Baghdad, clipped off his left arm and killed the soldier next to him. I think that has a profound effect on any parent, but especially a parent who's in uniform, in command in Iraq. Second, and I think more significantly, and I mean this seriously, was his experience between his first and second tours. He comes back and he's the military assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, which has effectively become the Pentagon uniform liaison to the State Department. He travels a lot with the Secretary of State. He sees where the levers of power are across the government. And he hears a very different take on Iraq than he's been hearing. The Pentagon has been very rosy about it. He hears the CIA's assessment, which is quite glum. He hears NSC, which is growing more and more pessimistic. He hears State, which is appalled. So he gets a different view of it, and he also knows who to talk to, who does Iraq across the government. And then finally, the third thing is he goes back to Iraq in late '06, and he sees an American policy that's ineffective, a Pentagon Council of Colonels study that's just concluding we are losing the war, and he says, if I keep this up the way they're going, we're going to lose it maybe on my watch, and I don't want that to happen. Now, he's talking to General Petraeus a lot at this time, and when Petraeus gets out there, Petraeus says to his senior commanders, I want everybody to act like this is your last tour in the military, because if we fail here, it really will be. Nobody's ever going to remember anything else you do. And I think Odierno and Petraeus were very different guys, but I really admire the way they had this determination to work together, and also with Crocker. We still have bifurcated command in Iraq. We should have one person in charge of the overall national effort, basic counterinsurgency theory. Petraeus, Odierno, and Crocker made this work, I think, simply by a almost superhuman determination to make it work. And I do worry that now you have Odierno home alone out there, a new corps commander coming in, and a new ambassador coming in with no Middle Eastern experience, unless his nomination gets blown up on the Hill. I think that's a very different situation, and it returns us to the era of bifurcated command, which was terribly ineffective. And I think it's a real tragedy that General Zinni's nomination for that job got trashed inside the Obama administration. I thought he would have been perfect as a kind of pro-consul overseeing both the civilian and military effort in Iraq. Any other questions? Yes, please.
I went to Iraq in the height of the surge in the spring of 2007, and I could gauge the amount of violence by the number of incoming indirect fire at the IZ, and also my office was right next to the CASH, the Combat Support Hospital, and I could tell by the number of helicopters coming in and out. By October or so, the numbers went down. What do you attribute the decline in violence to?
I know what you mean. The question was, she was in Iraq spring and summer, fall 07, and saw the decline in violence as the surge was implemented. What do I attribute that decline in violence to? It really struck me in interviews that when people began to think the surge was working, company commanders started noticing it in June, battalion commanders late June, early July, brigade commanders mid-July. General Petraeus told me he was persuaded by early August. I think because these rivulets began trickling together. It was, hey, this is really working. This is having an effect. After 6 months in which violence had gone shooting up. I think the first thing was the movement of troops out into the population. The establishment of 76, whatever it was, JSSs and COPs across Baghdad. A kind of persistent, constant presence, combined with very aggressive operations in the belts around Baghdad. The second thing was, by the time the surge began, the ethnic cleansing of Baghdad was largely complete. You have a few Sunni enclaves left in western Baghdad. David Kilcullen referred to them one day, cover your ears, as Sunni zoos. And I think that's kind of where we are now, the Sunni zoos of Baghdad. The third was putting the Sunni insurgency on the payroll. Speaking of senior command questions for JAGs, in my last interview with General Petraeus, I said, how did you sell the president on putting the Sunni insurgency on the payroll? It kind of must have been an interesting conversation. Petraeus said, oh, I didn't ask. And I said, one of the biggest policy changes in the war in the last couple of years, and you didn't run it by the president in the weekly VTC? And he said, no, it was within my existing authorities.
I'll tell you something.
If it was, and I think there's many people in the room who know those limits of existing authorities better than I, that's a very interesting decision. Second, I think that Petraeus really took a burden on himself, because if that had blown up in his face, he would have been blamed. And I think he knew it. But a really radical move in the war. Now, Petraeus also added he didn't expect it would grow like Topsy like that. When he started it, he didn't think it was going to be 100,000 former insurgents winding up on the payroll at the tune of $30 million a month, but it did. So I think there were several reasons, but the foremost was a very different American approach to the war that was embodied in several different ways.
If I could let me just say something. You're saying payroll. The mechanism was an interpretation of the Commander's Emergency Response Program. The authority for that is urgent humanitarian relief and reconstruction for the benefit of the Iraqi and Afghan people, the determination was nothing's more humanitarian than putting some young men with weapons to guard who are available and willing to stop shooting at Americans, to guard offices of local government, key infrastructure nodes. So they weren't put on a payroll, they were actually made fixed site security contractors, which were allowable under the SERP authority.
This is called the KBR solution to insurgencies.
Well, I don't think you can deny that the violence came down when these individuals had an ability to put something on the table for their families and to stop firing at troops. So much of this was economic, and had SERP not been available as an economic tool, the sticky power, nothing was there. And the Iraqis were not capable, Tom, at that point, as you know, in freeing up their own fiscal resources to do this.
And I'm not saying it was the wrong move. I think it was exactly the right move. And in fact, I expect to see moves like this in Afghanistan now.
Well, we have important legal rules associated with hiring foreign forces, and I didn't want your word payroll to be understood as an end around that. This was definitely within his authority.
Just a footnote on that is one day there was a soldier, American soldier, curious 19-year-old soldier, turns to one of these former insurgents, now working as a watchman. He's in Bakuba, and he says, "So, do you still want to kill me?" And the insurgent looks him up and down and says, "Yes, but not today." That's the way forward in Iraq. I mean, one day at a time is the way to eventually build stability and peace. How are we doing on time? Okay. Just throw something when you want to stop. Yes, please.
Oh, I had a question. I was at CENTCOM at the time when Mark was at MNFI, and you're a little bit of an indictment on the Goldwater Nichols and the combatant commanders authorities. And you're correct that neither General Casey nor General Abzey supported the surge. And as you point out, the surge did not succeed. And yet the same system that Goldwater Nichols generated, where combatant commanders are responsible for their regions, is the system that generated people like Tony Zinni, who became this co-consul that Anna Priest talked about. So I'm just kind of wondering why you kind of question the efficacy of Goldwater Nichols.
Now that you have the microphone, ask me that question again, and I'm not sure what where. I think it is.
Is it on? Can you? Okay. You questioned the. First of all, you said Odierno essentially bypassed the chain of command, went to Jack Keane. Those who were responsible for the strategy that was in effect, MNFI and CENTCOM, certainly had their authorities through SecDef to execute what the strategy was at that time. So it wasn't succeeding. And so, the NSC response is, well, we can replace that, we can change the strategy, or we can change the personnel executing. And so I don't think that's an indictment of Goldwater Nichols, that these combatant commanders, who are the very people who produce the Tony Zinnis of the world, I don't see that as an indictment of Goldwater Nichols, I guess.
Okay. I see it as an indictment of Goldwater Nichols because as long as people stayed within the Goldwater Nichols system, these questions were not being asked. It was only when a 3-star steps outside, goes up several echelons with a retired general, and takes it to the White House, that the sink is actually asked the right questions, that the MNFI commander is asked the basic questions that he should have been asked, that Goldwater Nichols is supposed to bring to the table, but wasn't. Yes, way back there? Yes, yeah.
Michael Cooper with Georgetown Law. You mentioned KBR. I worked for some time in Iraq with a humanitarian organization, rehabilitating schools and water treatment plants and stuff. We did competitive bidding with local contractors. We never had any security problems. Can you tell us, in your opinion, what was the role of the KBRs and the Halliburtons and Blackwaters in this sort of corporate gold rush to Iraq? And to what extent might that undermine our national interest?
The question is, what role did private corporations, KBR, Halliburton, Blackwater, play in the Iraq War? How should we think about it? I think historians will remember this as one of the great aberrations in this war, the extraordinary reliance on contractors. So there are now, as I understand it, more contractors in Iraq than there are U.S. troops. 200,000 contractors versus 140,000 U.S. troops. Of those 200,000, only about 20,000, I believe, are trigger pullers, though. And the notion of having mercenaries on the battlefield who are outside of military discipline and not clearly subject to any legal regime, I think was an extraordinary error in this war, and one of those gifts that's going to keep on giving. For example, if I were the commander of the 2nd Shanghai Light Infantry Regiment, I would put myself up for bid as the Shanghai Double Happiness Peace and Security Corporation. And I can underbid any American company in providing security to African presidents. I think we have established probably, and you guys know better than I do, precedents out there that will haunt us in the future about putting mercenary forces on the battlefield. Now, it wasn't really problematic. The Iraqis were bothered by it constantly. I remember walking out of our house in Baghdad one day. By the way, most reporters never lived in the green zone. Our Washington Post house is in the red zone. I was walking out of our house one day, and I was wearing khakis and a black polo shirt. And our security chief, Mohammed, said, you need to change the shirt. And I said, why? He said, you look like a security contractor. And you just make yourself a target. Iraqis, I think, had really come to loathe them. Where this really came home was the shooting incident, which square, September 07. Where was that square?
Missouri Square, September
yeah.
07.
Yeah. Because I think when the Blackwater guys shot up a square and I think killed 17 Iraqis, for several years that had been consistent with how a lot of units in Iraq operated. I remember talking to guys in the 4th ID about their first tour. They would shoot people walking with shovels at night on roads on the assumption that they were IED implanters. I remember I was with another unit that shot anybody who was flying pigeons off their roof because somebody had told them that the insurgents used pigeons to carry messages. That really trigger-happy attitude that a lot of units had early on was consistent with the way Blackwater operated. The difference was by 07, I didn't see any uniformed military units operating like that. And so that incident cast a really harsh light on the difference between the military and Blackwater at that point. If your top priority on your mission statement is protecting Iraqi civilians, you can't do that by killing them. So I think it was, all in all, though, a very worrisome move by the U.S. military. In retrospect, I think it would have been much better to say, task the Marine Corps with the job that was given Blackwater of protecting American officials outside the green zone. Okay, has anybody got a two-hander here, which is you're going to go home muttering to your spouse if you don't get asked the question? Okay.
Kurt Sanger, I'm a church advocate in the Marine Corps. I just want to know what lesson learned in Iraq you think would be most useful in Afghanistan, and also which one would not? Would you warn folks? Can you hear me? Am I using my Marine voice? What have we learned in Iraq that we should not use in Afghanistan?
It's hard, I think, for me to draw lessons from the Iraq War because I think it was so fundamentally misconceived at the outset that everything you do is fruit of the poison tree. This is why I think even though the surge failed, it was the right thing to do. It was because it was better than anything else. There are no moral solutions in Iraq. I think staying in Iraq is immoral. I think leaving Iraq would be more immoral. But there are no good answers there. By contrast, I think invading Afghanistan was exactly the right response to 9/11. And I speak as somebody who used to live in Afghanistan and indeed skied in Afghanistan and loved the place. So I think I'd be very wary of applying lessons, but the one lesson I think that I saw among senior commanders in Iraq over the last couple of years, and I talked a lot about the Army, but this is also in the Marines, like with Lieutenant Colonel Dale Alford, is have a little humility. Recognize that the American way is not the only way. The local solution is the sustainable solution. Find local structures and build on them. Recognize what a Marine General, John Allen, observed in Anbar. These people have an operating system 3,000 years old. Do you think you're going to change it? Thank you very much. If anybody wants me to sign books, I'll do it up here or wherever you want me to. Thank you.